The first thing the galaxy ever learned about the Mandalorians was the way they arrived, not in transports, not under a flag of parley. They came down out of the sky on living war machines, riders armored in a metal that a lightsaber could not cut, and a colony that existed at dawn would not exist by dark. For 3,000 years, that was the whole of what most worlds knew about them. The sky would fill with descending iron, and afterward the maps had to be redrawn. People learned the name, the way you learn the name of a thing that has already hurt you. Mandalore. What should be impossible is who those warriors actually were. They were not some ancient race of born killers, handed their ferocity through the blood. There was no bloodline. A Mandalorian was not a thing you were born as. It was a thing you became. A child dragged out of the ash of a burned world could put on the armor, speak the words, and stand as fully Mandalorian as a warrior whose ancestors had ridden war beasts 10,000 years before. That is the reason every enemy who ever set out to destroy them failed. You cannot wipe out a people that anyone can join. The openness had a price though, and the price is the thread running through everything tonight. A people bound together by a creed instead of a country will tear itself apart the moment they stop agreeing on what the creed means. And they did again and again for 10,000 years. The deadliest soldiers the galaxy ever produced spent more of their long history turning that ferocity on each other than on anyone else. And the gray world that bred them spent more time burning than at peace. They could not be conquered. So in the end, they did the conquering themselves, to themselves, over and over, until the planet was glass. That is where we are going tonight, the whole length of it, slow and quiet, from the first warrior who broke the great beasts of a gray world and wore their skull as his banner, down through the crusades and the wars that nearly ended the galaxy, to the night the sky finally came down on Mandalore for good and did not stop. There is no hurry. We have hours. Before we go any further into the dark, let me say one quiet thing, and then I will not interrupt the story again for a while. If these long histories are how you drift off, the single most useful thing you can do is tap the subscribe button. It is a small thing on your end. On my end, it is the whole reason I get to keep making these, keep digging through the old records and the buried timelines so you have something to fall asleep to. That is all. Subscribe if the channel has earned it, and let us get back to the Grey Planet and the people who would not stop fighting. The Grey Planet had something on it long before the warriors came, and that something was the reason the warriors mattered at all. Mythosaurs. The records that survive describe them as beasts the size of small mountains, armored in bone, with skulls that the Mandalorians would later take as their oldest symbol. You have seen that skull even if you never knew its name. The horned sigil stamped on their banners and burned into their armor is a mythosaur, and the reason they chose it tells you everything about how this culture understood itself. They did not take a flower or a star or a clasped pair of hands. They took the skull of the most dangerous thing they had ever managed to put down, and they wore it, so that anyone looking at them would know the first question already had its answer. What kind of people are these? The kind who killed that. According to the oldest legends, the first man to carry the name Mandalore did exactly that. He came to the Grey World, and he hunted the Mythosaurs, and he broke them, and in breaking them he claimed the planet, and he gave both the planet and himself a single name, Mandalore I. After that, the name stopped belonging to a man and started belonging to a position. Whoever led the Mandalorians took the name. There would be a Mandalore the Indomitable, a Mandalore the Ultimate, a Mandalore the Preserver, a long line of them stretching down the centuries, each one inheriting not a throne, but a title soaked in the blood of whoever held it last. You did not get crowned Mandalore. You took it, usually off the body of the one before you. Sit with the strangeness of that for a moment, because it shapes everything. In most of the galaxy, leadership passed through blood or election or appointment, the orderly transfer of authority from one holder to the next. On Mandalore, it passed through killing. The title was not a gift or a right, but a prize, and the only way to claim it was to be stronger than the one who held it. This meant that the leadership of the Mandalorians was, by design, always held by whoever was currently the most dangerous. And it meant that the transfer of power was almost always violent. A Mandalore reigned until someone better came along to take the mask off his corpse. There was a brutal honesty in it. No weak ruler could hide behind tradition or bureaucracy, because the moment a Mandalore showed weakness, a stronger warrior would simply remove him. But there was a brutal instability in it too, because a system that settles leadership through combat is a system perpetually one jewel away from civil war. And the Mandalorians spent a great deal of their history exactly there, one jewel away from tearing themselves apart over who deserved to wear the mask. The mask itself became almost as important as the warrior who wore it. It was a physical object, the helmet of Mandalore, passed from holder to holder down the centuries, and to possess it was to possess the legitimacy of rule. When a Mandalore died, the mask had to find its way to the next, and the journeys it took between holders were sometimes as dramatic as the reigns themselves. It was lost and found, hidden and recovered, carried into caves by war beasts, and dug out of battlefields by warriors who would become legends for the finding. The mask, like the Darksaber that would later eclipse it as the symbol of rule, carried the whole weight of the tradition in a single object, so that the history of the Mandalorians can almost be told as the history of the things they used to mark their leaders, the mask and the blade moving from hand to bloody hand across 10,000 years. Each transfer a story, each holder a chapter, the objects outlasting every warrior who ever claimed them. Now here is where the deep past gets strange, and where you have to understand that the Mandalorians were not at the start human at all. The progenitors of the whole tradition were a species called the Taung, tall, gray-skinned, covered in a hide like cracked leather, with faces that looked carved rather than grown. They came from Coruscant, of all places, the same world that would one day be the gleaming heart of the Republic and the seat of the Jedi. Back then, Coruscant was contested ground, and the Taung shared it with early humans, and the two fought for it across a span of time so long it barely registers as history anymore. The Taung lost. A united human front drove them off their birth world, and they carried that defeat with them like a stone swallowed and never digested. They went looking for a new world to take, and they found the Grey Planet, and they renamed themselves after the beasts they conquered there. The Dha Werda Verda, the Warriors of the Shadow, became the Mandalorians. That origin matters because it set the pattern. These were a people defined from the beginning by exile and grievance, and the conviction that the galaxy had taken something from them that they intended to take back with interest in blood. They did not build a culture around farming or trade or learning. They built it around the single act of conquest, and they got better at that one act than anyone else alive. The armor came early, and it never really changed in spirit. Beskar, Mandalorian iron, a metal mined from the Grey Planet and its moon that could turn a blaster bolt and, in thick enough plate, even hold against the cut of a lightsaber. Think about what that meant in a galaxy where the most powerful warriors carried swords of pure energy that sheared through blast doors. Everyone else who faced a Jedi faced a duel they had already lost. The Mandalorians walked toward them in iron that the Holy Blade could not simply pass through, and that single fact rewired the balance of the whole galaxy whenever the two collided. A Jedi against a man with a slug thrower is a foregone conclusion. A Jedi against a Mandalorian in full Beskar with a jetpack and a flamethrower and a lifetime of training in exactly how to kill people who could read his next move in the Force, was something else entirely. It was a real fight. Sometimes the Jedi lost. They learned to fight Force users the way you learn to fight anything, by doing it until the lessons were written in scar tissue. They studied the small tells. A Jedi telegraphs through the Force, and a Mandalorian could not feel the Force, so instead they overwhelmed the channels the Force fed on. Flood the field with too many threats, too much noise, too many bodies coming from too many angles, and the precognition that made a Jedi untouchable in a one-on-one duel started to fray. They built weapons specifically for this. Whipcord launchers to bind the arms, flame to fill the space a saber would otherwise carve through, Beskar to survive the strike that did land. They turned the act of killing a wizard into an engineering problem, and they solved it. Their mounts in those ancient days were as fearsome as they were. Basilisk war droids. Not droids in the polite modern sense, not protocol units shuffling down corridors, but enormous semi-living war machines, part beast and part engine, that a Mandalorian could ride into the vacuum of space and down onto the surface of a world from orbit. Picture the sky of some peaceful Republic colony on an ordinary morning, and then picture it filling with descending iron, each one ridden by a warrior in a horned helmet, and you have the recurring nightmare that the Rim worlds lived under for 3,000 years. The Mandalorians did not arrive by transport and disembark. They fell out of the sky on living siege engines, and where they landed, the maps had to be redrawn. For 3,000 years this went on. Generations born, blooded and buried, each pushing the crusades a little further, each adding new worlds to Mandalorian space and new skulls to the banners. It is hard to hold 3,000 years in your head. It is longer than most civilizations last in total. The Mandalorians spent that span doing essentially one thing, refining one craft. And the craft was war. And by the end of it, they were the most efficient instrument of violence the galaxy had yet produced. That is the foundation. Everything brutal that comes after is built on top of those 3,000 years of practice. The first time the Mandalorians stepped onto the main stage of galactic history, the one historians would actually record with names and dates, it was because they got drawn into someone else's war. That war was the Great Sith War, and the someone else was a fallen Jedi named Ulic Qel-Droma. And the Mandalore of that age was a warrior called Mandalore the Indomitable. The thing you have to understand about Mandalore the Indomitable is that he earned the second word of that name the hard way, and then lost the argument it was supposed to settle. The galaxy in his time was tearing itself apart. A dark side cult called the Krath had risen in the Empress Teta system, 7 worlds locked together in civil war, and the whole region had become a wound that would not close. Mandalore the Indomitable looked at that chaos the way his people always looked at chaos, as opportunity. A weakened, divided cluster of rich worlds was exactly the kind of prey the Crusades existed to take. So he led a new crusade into Tetan space, and his warriors began doing what they did best, raiding and burning and proving themselves against whatever rose to meet them. What rose to meet them was Ulic Qel-Droma. He had been a Jedi once, a promising one, and he had gone undercover into the Krath cult, intending to destroy it from within, and the cult had destroyed him instead. Or rather, it had remade him, pulling him down into the dark side so gradually that by the time he understood what was happening, he was already one of them. When the Mandalorians came raiding into Krath space, Ulic was the one who stood up to answer them. He and Mandalore the Indomitable met in single combat. This was the old way, the honorable way, 2 leaders deciding the fate of armies with their own hands so that the armies would not have to be spent settling a question the leaders could settle themselves. The stakes were the 7 worlds of the Empress Teta system and the combined military strength of both the Krath and the Mandalorians. Everything, in other words, the whole crusade, the whole future, wagered on one fight. Mandalore the Indomitable lost. And here is the cruelty inside the cruelty, the thing that makes this a Mandalorian story rather than just a battle. Ulic did not kill him. A Mandalorian who loses an honorable duel expects to die in it. Death in combat is not a tragedy in that worldview. It is the proper ending, the clean one, the one that closes a warrior's account with his worth intact. Ulic understood this, and so he refused to grant it. He spared Mandalore the Indomitable specifically to deny him the honorable death, specifically to make him live with the loss. And by sparing him, by the strange iron logic of Mandalorian honor, he bound the man to him. A Mandalore who had been bested and left alive owed his conqueror his service. So Mandalore the Indomitable pledged himself and his entire people to Ulic Qel-Droma, and the deadliest warriors in the galaxy became the muscle of the Sith war effort, all because of one duel and one deliberate act of mercy designed to wound deeper than any killing blow. What followed was the Mandalorians at the height of their ancient power turned loose on the Republic. They joined the Sith and the Krath in an assault on the Republic shipyards orbiting Forost, and Mandalore the Indomitable led his warriors through the corridors of the command station personally, cutting down everything in his path. The attack worked. Between the Mandalorian assault and the coordination of the larger fleet, the shipyards fell, and with them 300 Republic warships sitting docked and helpless. 300 capital ships, taken in a stroke, folded into the war effort against the very Republic that had built them. Then they went for the heart. With their stolen fleet and with the Republic chasing false leads out toward a distant jump station, Ulic and the Mandalorians struck at Coruscant itself, the same world the Taung had been driven from in the dawn of history. There is a terrible symmetry in that, and the Mandalorians, who forgot no grievance, surely felt it. Basilisk war droids rained down out of the sky onto the galactic capital, and the Mandalorian crusaders poured into Galactic City, and for a moment the ancient exiles were back on the world that had cast their ancestors out, this time descending as conquerors. The system he built had a logic all the way down, and the logic was merciless. On the worlds the Neo-Crusaders conquered, the defeated were given a choice, and it was the kind of choice that is not really a choice at all. You could join, you could put on the armor and become a Neo-Crusader yourself, take up the warrior's life and earn your place through combat like anyone else. Or you could refuse, and if you refused, you became a manufacturer for the clans, working the forges and the factories that fed the war machine, a laborer in everything but name, a slave in everything but the word, fight for us or work for us. Become a warrior or become a tool. There was no third door marked freedom, because freedom, to the Mandalorian way of thinking, was something you proved you deserved by being strong enough to take it, and a conquered people had already demonstrated they were not. This is the engine that made the Mandalorian Wars possible. An army that grew every time it won, that turned its conquests into either new soldiers or new production, that got stronger with each victory instead of weaker. Mandalore the Ultimate built a force that fed on the galaxy, and then he pointed it at the Galactic Republic, and the Republic was not ready for what came at it. The Mandalorian Wars began at the edges, the way these things do. Raids on the Outer Rim, worlds going quiet, distress calls that arrived too late to matter. The Republic, vast and slow and complacent after a long peace, treated the early attacks as a frontier nuisance, a problem for local defense forces, nothing that required the full attention of the core. That was the first mistake, and the Mandalorians made them pay for it with years of unanswered conquest. swallowing world after world, while Coruscant debated whether there was even a war happening at all. The Jedi made the second mistake, and it was a stranger one. When the Republic finally began to grasp the scale of the threat, the Jedi Order, in its wisdom, counseled patience. The Masters on the Council looked into the Force and saw something beyond the Mandalorians, a deeper shadow they could not quite identify, and they refused to commit the Order to the war until they understood what that shadow was. They were not wrong that something darker lurked behind the invasion. They were wrong about what their hesitation would cost. While the Council waited and meditated and searched for the hidden hand, the Mandalorians burned their way deeper into Republic space, and worlds that might have been saved were not, and a generation of people died waiting for the Guardians of Peace to decide that the war was real. Into that gap stepped a young Jedi who refused to wait. History would know him as Revan, though that was not the whole of his name when he started, and what he became is one of the great dark stories of the age too large to fully tell tonight. But his collision with the Mandalorians is the thing that matters here, because Revan is the one who finally understood how to beat them, and the understanding nearly cost him his soul. Revan and his friend Malachor defied the Jedi Council. They saw the suffering on the front lines, the worlds falling one after another, and they could not reconcile the Order's patience with the screaming need in front of them. So they left. They gathered other young Jedi who felt the same, the Revanchists they were called, and they went to war without the Council's blessing, and their conviction and their skill turned the tide that the Republic's armies alone could not. Revan rose to command the entire Republic war effort, a single brilliant mind finally matched against the Mandalorian machine. And he learned the lesson that breaking the Mandalorians required. You could not beat them by being more honorable than they were, because their honor was a weapon they understood far better than you did. You could not beat them by matching their ferocity, because ferocity was the one thing they had in infinite supply. You beat them by being willing to do the thing they would not expect a Jedi to do, the cold thing, the thing that wins wars but stains the winner. Revan studied the Mandalorian way until he understood it from the inside, until he could predict where Mandalore the Ultimate would strike and why. And then he used that understanding without mercy. He set traps that spent lives, his own side's lives, to destroy larger numbers of the enemy. He thought about the war the way Canderous Fett thought about it, as an engineering problem, and he was better at the engineering. The war turned on a world called Malachor V, and what happened there is one of the most monstrous acts in the history of the Republic, committed by its own defenders. Revan had a weapon, a device called the Mass Shadow Generator, capable of warping gravity itself into a killing force. He lured the bulk of the Mandalorian fleet, and a great many Republic ships besides, to Malachor V, and he sprang the trap, and he activated the generator. The gravitational catastrophe that followed tore ships apart, crushed the surface of the planet, and killed both fleets nearly to the last soul. Mandalorians and Republic forces alike annihilated together in a single deliberate act. The world itself was left a shattered, haunted ruin, so saturated with death that it became a wound in the Force, a place that would warp anyone who lingered there. For years, that was the state of them. The most feared soldiers in the galaxy, reduced to taking contracts, selling the only skill they had ever honed to whoever could pay, their grand crusading purpose dwindled to a paycheck. There is a particular bleakness in that. The spectacle of a warrior culture that lived for honor and glory reduced to killing strangers for credits because there was nothing left to believe in. Some of them made peace with it. Some of them drank. The people built entirely around war do not know what to do with themselves when the war ends and the defeat is total. One of those scattered warriors was a man named Canderous Ordo, and his story is the bridge from the old Mandalorians to whatever came next. He had fought in the wars, fought well, and he had survived them. And survival is its own kind of curse for a man raised to believe that dying in battle is the only good death. He spent the lean years as a mercenary, and in time he crossed paths with Revan again, the very man who had broken his people, though the circumstances of that meeting are tangled up in Revan's own strange fate and would take us far off the path tonight. What matters is that Canderous came to respect the man who had defeated the Mandalorians, came to understand that Revan had beaten them not by luck, but by genuinely outthinking them, and that respect planted an idea. The Mandalorians had not been beaten because they were weak. They had been beaten because they had been led poorly, used as someone else's tool, thrown into a war they did not control. What they needed was not more ferocity. They had always had ferocity. What they needed was wisdom to govern it. Canderous eventually recovered the lost mask of Mandalore, and he took up the name himself, becoming Mandalore the Preserver. The title is the Tell, not the Conqueror, not the Indomitable, not the Ultimate, the Preserver. For the first time, the leader of the Mandalorians took a name that pointed at keeping something alive rather than taking something by force. He gathered the scattered clans, rebuilt them from the diaspora, regrouped the Neo-Crusaders under a steadier hand, and he set about the slow work of giving his people a future that did not end in another Malachor. Under him, the Mandalorians stepped back from the brink of extinction. He could not make them what they had been at their height. Nobody could. But he kept them from vanishing, and for a culture that had just watched its founding species die out, mere survival was an achievement that justified the name he chose. Pre Vizsla held the Darksaber, and he meant to use it to take Mandalore back for the warriors. But before we follow Death Watch to its strange and catastrophic fate, we have to bring in the man whose face would become the most recognizable Mandalorian image in the entire galaxy, even though his actual claim to the title was disputed for the rest of time. Jango Fett. Jango carried the most famous surname in Mandalorian history, the name of Canderous Fett, reaching all the way down across the millennia. Though whether the bloodline was real or the name simply inherited the way the Mandalore title was inherited is one of those questions that history muddied. What is not disputed is what he was. A foundling raised in the Mandalorian way after his family was killed, who grew into possibly the deadliest single warrior of his generation. He fought in the civil wars that racked Mandalore in his youth, the endless grinding conflict between factions, and he earned a reputation that spread far beyond his people. He became, in time, the most sought-after bounty hunter in the galaxy, the standard against which all others were measured, a man in distinctive blue armor with a jetpack and a pair of blaster pistols, and a calm that never seemed to break no matter how bad the situation got. It was that reputation that brought him to the attention of a Sith Lord, though Jango never knew that was what he was dealing with. He was selected to be the genetic template for an army, a clone army, secretly commissioned, built on a distant water world called Kamino. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers grown from Jango Fett's DNA because someone with very long plans had decided that the best raw material for the perfect soldier was the galaxy's perfect warrior. Jango agreed to it for a price, credits, and one thing more. He asked for an unaltered clone of his own, a son, grown without the genetic tampering that made the army soldiers grow fast and obey without question. A boy who would simply be his, raised by him, in the Mandalorian way that had raised him. That boy was Boba Fett, and Jango raised him on Kamino in the shadow of the cloning facility, teaching him the warrior's craft, preparing him for the life that was the only life Jango knew how to pass on. The terrible irony, the thing that sits at the center of Jango's story like a stone, is that the army grown from his body became the instrument that destroyed the Jedi Order, and Jango himself died before he could see any of it. He met his end on the dusty arena world of Geonosis, at the very battle that began the Clone Wars, killed by a Jedi Master in front of his son. Boba, still a child, watched his father's head come off his shoulders in the chaos of the arena, and then climbed down afterward and picked up the empty helmet from the dirt and held it. That image, a boy holding his dead father's helmet on a killing ground, is where the most famous Mandalorian story of all properly begins. And it begins, as so many Mandalorian stories do, in grief and in violence, and in the long shadow of a war that someone else started. Death Watch broke over this. They had wanted a warrior restoration, and instead they had handed their world to a Sith, Bo-Katan Kryze, who was Satine's own sister and who had thrown in with Death Watch against her pacifist sibling, could not stomach following Maul. She and a portion of the warriors broke away, refusing to serve the outsider they had inadvertently crowned. The faction split, the way Mandalorian factions always split, and now there were Mandalorians fighting Mandalorians again, while a Sith sat in the seat of power and held the Black Blade, and Satine died for it. Maul, who understood that the Sith who had abandoned him would feel any wound dealt to those he cared about, used the captured Duchess as bait and as a message. He killed her in front of the Jedi who loved her, deliberately, cruelly, to inflict pain on an enemy who was not even there. Satine Kryze, who had spent her whole life trying to lead her people away from exactly this kind of violence, died as a pawn in a Sith's revenge scheme, murdered to send a message she had no part in. The pacifist's reward for a lifetime of peace was to be killed to hurt someone else. There is no justice in it. That is rather the point. The Mandalorian story does not run on justice. It runs on the iron logic of strength and the long accumulating weight of consequence. And Satine's death is what happens when someone tries to step off that wheel and the wheel rolls over them anyway. The galaxy's response to a Sith-ruling Mandalore came in the form of the Siege of Mandalore, one of the last great battles of the Clone Wars, and it brought the story full circle in a way that the warriors of the deep past would have recognized. A joint force of the Republic and the Mandalorian resistance, the ones who had refused to follow Maul, moved to retake the world. The campaign was led on the ground by a young Jedi who was not quite a Jedi anymore, Ahsoka Tano, fighting alongside Bo-Katan's warriors with clone troopers, soldiers grown from the body of the Mandalorian Jango Fett, fighting on the surface of the Mandalorian homeworld. Think about that closing of the circle. The clones of a Mandalorian deployed to liberate Mandalore in an army that was about to be turned into the instrument of galactic genocide. The threads of this history knot together at Mandalore in a way almost too neat to be borne. Maul was defeated and captured. The resistance won the surface, and for one bright moment, it looked as though Mandalore might have a future, with the Sith expelled and the warriors who had fought for liberation poised to rebuild. The Jedi Council recognized Bo-Katan Kryze as the leader of the Mandalorians, the natural choice, sister to the murdered Duchess and commander of the resistance that had taken the world back. And then Order 66 came, and the clones grown from Jango Fett's body turned on the Jedi beside them, and the galaxy fell into darkness in a single coordinated night, and Mandalore's brief moment of hope was swallowed whole by the rise of the Empire before it could become anything at all. Bo-Katan held the leadership of a people, but the galaxy that leadership existed in had just ceased to be. The Republic was gone. The Jedi were being hunted to extinction, and the empire that rose in their place had no patience at all for a world full of armed warriors with a 10,000-year history of refusing to bend. Before we follow the Mandalorians down into the long dark of the Empire, it is worth slowing down and looking closely at what these people actually believed, because the beliefs are the thing that makes the brutality coherent rather than merely savage. A people who fought for 10,000 years were not simply violent the way a storm is violent. They had a philosophy, a code, a whole architecture of meaning built around the act of war. And understanding that architecture is the only way to understand why they kept choosing the fire over and over again across all those centuries. At the center of it sat the Resolners, the 6 tenets, the things a Mandalorian had to do to be a Mandalorian. The names of these tenets meant, roughly, that you wore the armor, that you spoke the language, that you defended yourself and your family, that you raised your children in the Mandalorian way, that you contributed to the welfare of your clan, and that when the Mandalore called, you answered and rallied to the cause. Look at what is in that list and what is not. There is nothing about blood, nothing about where you were born or who your parents were or what species you belonged to. Every single tenet is something you do, an action, a choice renewed daily. This is the deepest truth of the whole culture, the thing that survived every defeat. Mandalorian was a verb. You were not born one, and you could not simply declare yourself one. You became one by doing the things, and you remained one only as long as you kept doing them. A Mandalorian who set down the armor and the language and the creed stopped being Mandalorian, not as a matter of law, but as a matter of fact. The way a fire that stops burning stops being a fire. That is why the foundling tradition mattered so much, and why it was not the soft, charitable thing it might sound like to outside ears. The Mandalorians took in foundlings, orphans and abandoned children and the cast-offs of 100 wars, and they raised them as their own. And those children grew up to be Mandalorians as complete and as deadly as any. To a culture obsessed with strength, this might seem strange, this gathering up of the weak and the lost. But it was not weakness, it was the engine of their immortality. A bloodline can be hunted to extinction. The Empire would later try exactly that and discover the problem. But a people who replenish themselves from the endless supply of the galaxy's orphaned and broken children can never truly be wiped out, because every war, including the wars waged against them, produces fresh foundlings, and some of those foundlings will find their way to the armor. The Mandalorians turned the galaxy's grief into their own renewal. Every child a war made an orphan was a potential Mandalorian, and so the more the galaxy bled, the more raw material there was for the creed. It is a chilling kind of resilience when you see it clearly. They were a people who could not be ended by killing, because killing only fed them. The armor itself was more than protection, though as protection it was unmatched. Beskar, worked by an armorer who held a near-sacred role in the community, was passed down through generations, reforged and rebalanced, and handed from parent to foundling like a story told in metal. The suit of Mandalorian armor carried history in it. The dents were memories. The colors meant things, though the meanings shifted across the ages and the clans. There were traditions that read a warrior's painted plate the way you might read a face, signals of grief and vengeance and honor and rank encoded in pigment. To wear the armor was to wear the entire weight of the culture's expectation, and to take a Mandalorian's armor from his body after killing him was both the ultimate trophy and, in some readings of the code, a grave dishonor, depending on who you asked and which century you asked them in. Because that was the other truth about the Mandalorians. There was never just one code. The creed fractured into as many interpretations as there were factions, and the factions fought over the interpretations as fiercely as they fought over anything else, which is to say, to the death. His story turned on a foundling of his own, a small green child of enormous power in the Force, whom he was hired to capture and instead chose to protect. And in protecting that child, he was drawn step by step back into the larger Mandalorian world he had been hidden from. He learned that his sect, the Children of the Watch, were considered zealots and extremists even by other Mandalorians, that the rule he had built his entire identity around, the never-removed helmet, was not the universal creed he had been raised to believe, but the harsh doctrine of a single fringe faction. He met Bo-Katan Kryze, still alive, still carrying the grief of the purge and the shame of the surrender, still longing to reclaim Mandalore. And he came into possession, by an accident of combat, of the Darksaber. There is the curse again, threading through one more life. He won the Darksaber in battle, fairly by the ancient rule, which meant that he and not Bo-Katan now held the only legitimate claim to lead Mandalore. He did not want it. He was a bounty hunter and a single father to a foundling, not a king, and the last thing he desired was rule over a shattered people. But the rule was the rule. The blade had to be won, and he had won it, and Bo-Katan, who had once held the blade by gift and lost it to the Empire, could not simply be handed it again without breaking the very rule that legitimacy depended on. The tragedy of her life compounded itself in that moment. The leadership of her people, which she had wanted her whole life, kept arriving in her hands in ways that did not count, and being taken away again. How that knot finally untied, and whether the Mandalorians reclaimed their poisoned homeworld and bathed in the living waters and began the long work of becoming a people again, rather than a scattering of embers, belongs to a more recent chapter than the deep history we came here to walk tonight. The point for our purposes is simpler. The creed survived. Through the clone who was never quite accepted, and the foundling raised by zealots, and the broken leader who could never quite hold her claim, the thing Canderous Fett had built 10,000 years before, the idea that could wear any face, persisted past every attempt to end it. The bloodline died with the Taung. The homeworld was bombed to glass. The nation was scattered twice across the millennia. And still, in hidden coverts and lonely lives, the foundlings were taken in and taught the words and given the armor, and the fire that could not be killed went on quietly burning. Now that we have walked the whole length of it once, from the Mythosaur skull to the scattered embers, it is worth going back into the deep past and lingering in the places we passed through quickly. Because the ancient wars hold the most brutal material of all, and the brutality is the reason these warriors are remembered at all. The thing about the early crusades is that they were not battles in the modern sense, with front lines and supply chains and the careful arithmetic of attrition. They were closer to natural disasters that happened to be made of people. A Mandalorian crusade arriving at a world was less like an invasion and more like a season, a thing that came and took what it wanted and left the survivors to rebuild in the cleared ground. Consider how a Mandalorian of the old crusading age actually made war, because the method is its own kind of horror. The basilisk war droids were the centerpiece, and they deserve a fuller telling. These were not vehicles that a warrior climbed into. They were mounts that a warrior bonded with, semi-sentient war machines grown as much as built, with a cruel intelligence of their own and a hunger for battle that matched their riders. A basilisk could operate in atmosphere and in the vacuum of space alike. It could carry its rider down from orbit in a screaming dive, claws extended, and strike a planet's surface like a meteor that got up afterward and kept killing. Mounted on a basilisk, a single Mandalorian became a one-being assault force, armored in Beskar, breathing from the armor's own supply, able to fight for 10 hours in the void before the air ran out. An entire flight of them descending on a colony was the end of that colony's world in the most literal sense. The sky filled with iron, and then the iron was among you, and there was nothing in the arsenal of an ordinary world that could meaningfully answer it. The Crusaders rode these things for 3,000 years, and in 3,000 years of riding them, they developed a relationship to violence that is genuinely difficult for an outsider to comprehend. War was not a thing that happened to them. War was the medium they lived in, the way water is the medium a fish lives in, so total and so constant that they could not really conceive of an existence outside it. A young Mandalorian of the crusading age was raised from infancy to understand that the purpose of his life was to test himself against worthy enemies, that a death in bed was a kind of failure, that the highest thing he could aspire to was to fall in a battle so fierce that the telling of it would outlive him. This is why the contempt for the Ubdurians ran so deep, to a people for whom war was the entire meaning of existence. A people who would not fight were not merely different. They were, in the most fundamental Mandalorian sense, not fully alive, and the destruction of their world was less an atrocity than a kind of cosmic housekeeping, the removal of beings who had failed the only test that mattered. There is no arguing with a worldview like that. You can only survive it or be erased by it. And for 3,000 years, most worlds that met the Crusaders were erased. The conflict with the Jedi gave the Crusades their defining shape, because the Jedi were the one enemy worthy enough to satisfy the Mandalorian hunger for a real test. Everyone else was prey. The Jedi were a hunt. A Mandalorian who killed a Jedi had done the thing that proved his worth beyond any possible dispute, had bested a wizard warrior who could move objects with his mind and see attacks before they came and cut through steel with a sword of light, and had done it with iron and cunning and raw refusal to be afraid. The murals that survived from the ancient Crusades, the cubist images of Mandalorians fighting Jedi, were not propaganda in the modern sense. They were closer to scripture. They recorded the central drama of Mandalorian existence, the warrior against the wizard, the iron against the light, and they were painted to last so that future generations would know what their ancestors had dared. There was a moment in the deep history when the galaxy tried to make the Mandalorians stop, and the attempt left one of the deepest scars of all. It is remembered as the Mandalorian Excision. After yet another era of Mandalorian aggression, the Republic and the Jedi resolved to end the threat not by conquering the warriors, which had never worked, but by attacking the source of their strength, which was the world itself and its capacity to sustain a warrior society. The excision devastated the surface of Mandalore, scouring it, turning fertile ground to the white desert of crystalline grass and fused sand that later ages would know. The logic was grim and almost despairing. If you cannot defeat the warriors, perhaps you can ruin the ground that grows them. Perhaps a world that can no longer feed a large population, can no longer field a large army. It was an attack on a planet's ability to be a home, and it worked in the narrow sense that it diminished Mandalore's capacity to sustain the old crusading hordes. But it did not stop the Mandalorians, because by then the Mandalorians were no longer truly dependent on any single world. The creed had outgrown the planet. You could scour Mandalore to glass, and the foundling tradition would still gather warriors from the orphans of 100 other worlds. The excision wounded the homeworld grievously and changed its character forever, and it bought the galaxy a respite. But it did not solve the problem, because the problem was never really the planet. The problem was the idea, and you cannot bomb an idea into glass. This is the pattern that repeats so many times across the 10,000 years that it stops looking like a series of events and starts looking like a law of nature. Someone tries to end the Mandalorians by force. The force succeeds tactically and fails strategically. The warriors are scattered, the homeworld is ruined, the nation is broken, and the watching galaxy concludes that the Mandalorian threat is finally finished. And then, a generation or a century or 1,000 years later, the embers gather, the foundlings grow up, a new Mandalore claims the mask or wins the blade, and the horned skull appears again on the banners of a people the galaxy thought it had erased. Malachor V did not end them. The excision did not end them. The long imperial occupation, and even the Night of 1,000 Tears did not end them, only scattered them once more into the diaspora from which they had reassembled themselves before. The Mandalorians are, in a sense, the galaxy's recurring proof that you cannot kill a way of life by killing the people who happen to be living it at the moment, as long as the way of life knows how to recruit its own replacements from the wreckage of every war, including the wars waged to destroy it. And yet, and this is the genuinely tragic turn at the heart of the whole history, the thing that finally did the most damage to the Mandalorians was never any outside enemy. It was themselves. Count the great catastrophes and look at their causes. Mandalore the Indomitable bound his people to a fallen Jedi and then to a witch, and they bled for someone else's war. Mandalore the Ultimate built a machine so aggressive it provoked a response monstrous enough to break it. The late factions tore each other apart over the question of what a Mandalorian should be, and in the chaos of that infighting, they handed their world to a Sith. Death Watch wanted a warrior restoration and crowned an outsider who murdered their Duchess. The division over Bo-Katan's claim to the Darksaber left them unable to unite when unity was the only thing that could have saved them from the Empire. Over and over, the fatal wound came from inside. A people who could not be conquered from outside were endlessly, almost compulsively conquered from within, undone by the same ferocious individualism and the same refusal to submit that made them invincible against external foes. The thing that made them impossible to defeat made them impossible to govern, and a people impossible to govern will, given enough time, defeat themselves. There is a dark wisdom buried in that, the kind of thing worth turning over slowly as you drift towards sleep. The Mandalorians were never destroyed by their enemies. Their enemies could only ever scatter them. What broke them again and again was the cost of their own nature, the price of being a people who valued strength above unity and honor above survival, and the proving of the self above the preservation of the whole. They paid that price for 10,000 years, and they kept choosing to pay it, because to stop paying it would have meant becoming something other than Mandalorian, and that, to them, was a fate worse than any defeat. Satine tried to make them choose survival over the creed, and they killed her for it in a sense, or at least the wheel she tried to stop rolled over her. The creed always won the internal argument, and the creed always cost them everything, and they paid and somehow endured, scattered but never gone, broken but never finished, the most brutal and the most resilient people the galaxy ever produced, undone forever by their own refusal to be anything less than what they were. The Mandalorian Wars reward a closer look than we gave them the first time through, because they are the clearest case study in the whole history of what it took to actually beat these people, and the answer is unsettling. It took a man willing to become a monster. Revan went into that war a Jedi who believed in protecting the innocent, and he came out of it the architect of Malachor V, and the distance between those two things is the real subject of the Mandalorian Wars, more than any battle map. Start with how the war began, because the beginning shows the Mandalorian method at its most patient and most cruel. Mandalore the Ultimate did not announce himself. He probed. For years before the open war, Mandalorian raids tested the edges of Republic space, small enough to be dismissed, frequent enough to map the Republic's responses, a slow, careful reconnaissance disguised as banditry. The Ultimate was learning where the Republic was strong and where it was soft, which worlds would be defended and which would be written off, how long it took the slow machinery of the Senate to notice that something was wrong, and how much longer to do anything about it. By the time the full invasion came, he knew his enemy better than his enemy knew itself, and he struck along exactly the lines of least resistance, taking the worlds the Republic had quietly decided were not worth defending, and using each one as a stepping stone to the next. It was a masterpiece of cold planning wrapped in the appearance of barbarian ferocity, and that combination, the savage face over the calculating mind, is Casus Fett's fingerprint all over the war. The Neo-Crusaders looked like a horde, they fought like a horde, but they were directed by an intelligence that understood logistics and politics and the psychology of a complacent enemy. And that intelligence is what made the Horde nearly unstoppable. The worlds that fell in the early war fell hard. The Mandalorians had no interest in the careful occupation that came later in galactic history, the bureaucratic subjugation of the Empire. They came to fight, and where a world resisted, the resistance was answered with the full weight of the crusading tradition. Cities reduced, populations sorted into the warriors and the producers. The infrastructure of conquered worlds turned immediately to the service of the next conquest. And the Republic, paralyzed by its own size and its own caution, and the Jedi Council's strange insistence on waiting, watched it happen and did nothing that mattered for years. Whole sectors fell, while the Senate debated. A generation of frontier citizens died waiting for a rescue that the core kept deciding could wait a little longer. The moral weight of that delay is the thing that drove Revan to defy the Council, and it is worth sitting with because the Jedi who counseled patience were not cowards or fools. They genuinely sensed a deeper darkness behind the Mandalorian invasion, a hidden hand. And they were genuinely right that one existed. Their error was in thinking they had time to understand it before acting, when the cost of understanding was paid in worlds. Revan's genius was to see that the Mandalorians could be beaten only by a mind willing to think the way they thought, without the restraints that made the Jedi predictable. He studied them obsessively. He learned their honor codes, not to respect them, but to exploit them. Because a code is a pattern, and a pattern can be used against the one who follows it. A Mandalorian who would always answer a challenge could be lured by a challenge. A warrior culture that prized the honorable death could be denied it strategically, the way Ulic had once denied it to Mandalore the Indomitable, turned into a weapon. Revan fought the Mandalorians as a problem to be solved, rather than an enemy to be matched, and he was willing to spend whatever the solution cost, including the lives of his own soldiers, including ultimately his own soul. He set traps that he knew would kill Republic forces, accepting those deaths as the price of killing more Mandalorians, doing the cold arithmetic that the Jedi Council's conscience would never have permitted. He won because he stopped being the kind of person the Mandalorians knew how to fight, and the cost of that transformation is the tragedy that follows him for the rest of his strange story. Malachor V was the culmination of that cold logic, and it is worth understanding precisely what made it so monstrous beyond the raw body count. Revan did not simply win a battle there. He engineered a massacre that consumed both armies, and he did it with a weapon that did not distinguish between sides. The mass shadow generator was a device that turned gravity itself into a weapon, and when it activated over Malachor V, it did not target the Mandalorians specifically. It crushed everything in its reach, Mandalorian and Republic alike. The loyal soldiers who had followed Revan into the trap as surely as the enemy he had lured there. He spent his own fleet to destroy the enemy fleet, knowingly, as a deliberate tactic. The planet itself was torn apart by the gravitational catastrophe, its surface broken, and the sheer concentration of death in that single moment tore a wound in the Force so deep that the world became a place of permanent dread, where the echoes of all those simultaneous deaths lingered and warped anyone who came near. Mandalore the Ultimate himself fell at Malachor, slain by Revan, and with him the leadership of the Neo-Crusaders, and the great machine that had eaten half the Outer Rim finally seized and died. But notice what Malachor V did to the victors, because this is the part the Mandalorians would have understood better than the Republic did. The Jedi who fought there were never the same. The trauma of being part of that mass death, of feeling all those lives extinguished at once through the Force, hollowed them out. Some lost their connection to the Force entirely, cut themselves off from it because the pain of feeling was unbearable. Some followed Revan into the darkness in the years after, because once you have done a thing like Malachor V, the line between Jedi and Sith starts to look less like a wall and more like a step you have already taken. The weapon that broke the Mandalorians also broke the people who wielded it, and the consequences rolled forward into the Jedi Civil War and the near collapse of the Order that followed. The Mandalorians, in their defeat, had taught the Republic a lesson the Republic did not want to learn, which is that you cannot defeat a thing built entirely around the embrace of violence without embracing violence yourself. And in embracing it, you become, at least a little, the thing you set out to destroy. The Mandalorians lost the war and still, in a sense, won the argument, because they proved that their way was right about one terrible thing. In the end, strength was the only currency that settled anything, and everyone who wanted to beat them had to pay in it. Canderous Fett himself, the architect of the whole Neo-Crusader system, survived the war that his system had made possible, and his survival is its own quiet commentary on the Mandalorian way. The man who built the machine outlived the machine. He had been the mind behind Mandalore the Ultimate, the strategist who turned the scattered post-Sith war clans into the most fearsome army the galaxy had seen. And when that army died at Malachor V, Canderous Fett simply continued, the way Mandalorians always continued, the idea outliving the institution. His name passed down through the millennia, carried by warriors who may or may not have been his blood, but who claimed his legacy, all the way to Jango and Boba, so that the surname Fett became, in the end, the most enduring single thread in all of Mandalorian history, a name that began with the man who reinvented what a Mandalorian was, and ended with the bounty hunter whose face launched an army of clones. There is a strange immortality in that, the immortality of a name attached to an idea, surviving long after the bodies that first carried it had turned to dust on a dozen battlefields. The Darksaber deserves a fuller telling than we managed the first time, because it is the single thread that ties the deep past to the final age, and the story of how it came to exist is one of the strangest in all of Mandalorian history. It was forged by Tara Vizsla, and Tara Vizsla was a contradiction made flesh, the only person ever to be both a Mandalorian and a Jedi at the same time. Think about how impossible that should have been. The Mandalorians and the Jedi had been killing each other for thousands of years by the time Tara Vizsla lived. They were natural enemies, opposite answers to the question of how to live in a galaxy full of power. The warrior and the monk, the iron and the light. And here was a man who was both, taken as a Force-sensitive child into the Jedi Order and trained in its ways while never renouncing the Mandalorian creed of his birth. He bridged the two traditions that had spent millennia trying to destroy each other, and as a symbol of that bridge he forged a lightsaber, unlike any other, a blade of black plasma shaped like the flat sword of his people, rather than the round beam of the Jedi, an object that was both a Jedi weapon and a Mandalorian one, both at once the way he was. When Tara Vizsla died, the Jedi kept the Darksaber in their temple, as they kept the relics of their dead, and the Mandalorians, who never forgot a thing that had once been theirs, eventually took it back. House Vizsla, his descendants, raided the Jedi Temple and reclaimed the blade, and from that moment the Darksaber stopped being merely a weapon and became a symbol. To hold it was to hold the legacy of the only man who had ever been both Mandalorian and Jedi, and over the centuries that symbolic weight calcified into law. Whoever held the Darksaber could claim to lead all Mandalore. And because the Mandalorians settled questions of leadership in combat, the blade had to be won in combat to confer that right. A Darksaber taken from a defeated foe meant legitimate rule. A Darksaber acquired any other way meant a claim with a crack running through it. This is the rule that would curse the final age. And you can see the machinery of the curse if you trace the blade's last passages from hand to hand. Vizsla, descendant of the house that first reclaimed it, held it legitimately and led Deathwatch with it. Maul took it from Vizsla in a duel fairly, by the rule, which made a Sith the legitimate holder of the symbol of Mandalorian rule. A fact so galling to the Mandalorians that many of them broke rather than accept it, even though by their own iron law, Maul's claim was sound. The blade later came to Bo-Katan, but it came to her as a gift, handed over by those who wished her to lead. And that gift broke the rule and cracked her claim. And the traditionalists never accepted her, and the disunity that followed helped doom Mandalore in the Purge. Then the blade was lost to Moff Gideon when Bo-Katan surrendered it to the Empire. And then, generations later, it was won again in combat by a foundling bounty hunter who did not want it, which made him the legitimate holder and left Bo-Katan, who had wanted leadership her entire life, once again holding a claim that did not count. The blade moved through all those hands, and at every step the rule about winning it shaped the destiny of the entire people. An object and a rule about the object, governing the fate of a civilization. That is a very Mandalorian thing when you think about it. A people who believed that legitimacy came only through combat built their final tragedy out of a sword that had to be won, and then kept failing to win it the right way, and kept paying for the failure in blood. The armor and the weapons that made the Mandalorians what they were deserve their own slow consideration, because the gear was never separate from the philosophy. Beskar, Mandalorian iron, was the foundation of everything. Mined from the homeworld and its moon, it was one of the very few materials in the galaxy that could withstand a lightsaber, and that single property reshaped every encounter between Mandalorians and Force users for 10,000 years. A Jedi's blade which sheared through blast doors and deflected blaster fire would skitter off a Beskar plate or bite into it without passing through. This meant that a Mandalorian in full Beskar could do the one thing no other warrior in the galaxy could reliably do, which was survive the first strike of a lightsaber and still be standing to answer it. The metal was so valuable and so central to Mandalorian identity that it was hoarded, passed down, reforged across generations, and the working of it was entrusted to the armorers, who held a role that was part smith and part priest, keepers of the metal and the traditions bound up in it. When the Empire bombed Mandalore in the Purge, part of what it was destroying was the source of the Beskar itself, the mines that had armed the warriors for 10,000 years, an attack on the material foundation of the culture as much as on its people. Satine's death at Maul's hands was calculated to be as cruel as possible, and the cruelty was not even primarily aimed at her. Maul killed her to wound Obi-Wan Kenobi, the Jedi who had once defeated him and who, Maul knew, cared for Satine. He brought her close to Kenobi, let the Jedi believe rescue was possible, and then ran her through, specifically so that Kenobi would have to watch, so that the pain would be maximized, so that Maul's revenge against the man who had cut him in half would be paid in the currency of grief. Satine, who had given her entire life to the cause of peace, who had kept her world neutral through the bloodiest war in galactic memory, who had tried harder than anyone to break the cycle of Mandalorian violence, died as a prop in a Sith's personal vendetta, her death meaningful to her killer only as a tool to hurt a third party. The pacifist did not even get a death that was about her. She was used all the way to the end by the violence she had spent her life opposing. There is no crueler comment the history could make on the futility of her dream than the manner of her death. The siege of Mandalore that followed was the Clone Wars arriving at last on the world that had tried so hard to stay out of them. And the shape of it is worth tracing because of how the threads converge. The forces that came to take Mandalore back from Maul were a coalition, and the coalition itself tells the whole tangled story. There were the Mandalorian resistance fighters under Bo-Katan, warriors who had broken from Maul and now fought to reclaim their world from the outsider they had accidentally enthroned. There was Ahsoka Tano, a former Jedi, leading the campaign on the ground. And there was a clone army, hundreds of thousands of soldiers grown from the body of Jango Fett, a Mandalorian deployed to liberate the Mandalorian homeworld. Stand back far enough and the symmetry is almost unbearable. The genetic legacy of one Mandalorian, mass-produced into an army, fighting to free the world that produced him, in a war that was about to end with that same army turning on its allies and ushering in the darkness. The clones who fought to liberate Mandalore would, within days, receive the order that turned them into the executioners of the Jedi. And the brief liberation of Mandalore would be swallowed by the rise of the Empire before it could mean anything. Maul was beaten. Ahsoka and the Resistance took him, and for a moment the world was free. And then the Order came, the one buried in the clones since their creation on Kamino. The contingency that turned the soldiers grown from Jango Fett's body against the Jedi they had fought beside, and the galaxy fell into the long night of the Empire in the space of a single coordinated betrayal. Ahsoka survived it only barely, and only by the loyalty of one clone who fought his own programming. Mandalore, freed from a Sith one day, fell under the shadow of an empire the next, and Bo-Katan held the leadership of a people whose entire world had just ceased to exist. Everything the siege had won was erased before the dust settled. That is the rhythm of Mandalorian history in its final age. Hope and ruin arriving so close together that they blur into a single motion. The victory and the catastrophe folded into the same few days. The years of imperial occupation before the final purge were a slow grinding indignity, and they are worth dwelling on because they show the Empire learning the same lesson every conqueror of Mandalore had learned, and reaching the same despairing conclusion. At first, the Empire tried to rule Mandalore the way it ruled everywhere, through control and administration and the threat of force. It installed governance, exploited the Beskar mines, stripped the world of its iron to arm the Imperial war machine, and tried to fold the Mandalorians into the Imperial Order as a subject people like any other. It did not work because Mandalorians do not become a subject people. They resist by reflex, by creed, by the deepest structure of who they are. A people for whom submission is the one unforgivable failure cannot be made to submit, only made to die. And the Empire, after enough resistance, enough sabotage, enough warriors slipping away into the wastes to fight on, began to understand that the only way to truly pacify Mandalore was to depopulate it. Bo-Katan's resistance in those years was the last great Mandalorian stand, and it carried all the doomed nobility and all the fatal division of the entire history compressed into one final campaign. She fought the Empire with everything she had, and she had a great deal because the warriors who rallied to her were the inheritors of 10,000 years of lethality. but she fought under the shadow of the cracked claim, the Darksaber held by gift. And that crack ran through the resistance the way it ran through everything in the late history. Not all Mandalorians would follow a leader whose legitimacy the traditionalists questioned. The old factionalism, the eternal inability to fully unite, persisted even in the face of an enemy that meant to exterminate them all. And a Mandalore who cannot unite the clans cannot save them, which had been true at the height of the Crusades and was true now at the very end. The same structural weakness, delivering the same result one final time. When the Empire decided that Mandalore was more useful as an example than as a possession, the order to purge it was given, and the Night of 1,000 Tears unfolded with a thoroughness that exceeded even the long history of atrocity that preceded it. We walked through it once already. The bombers and the fusion bombs, and the cities turned to slag, and the droids picking through the rubble to finish the survivors. But sit for a moment with the human shape of it, the texture of a single night in which a people who had survived 10,000 years of war met an enemy finally willing and able to do the thing all their previous enemies had only attempted. The recruits who died with a future. The young warriors who would have carried the creed forward, massacred in their gathered fields before they could become the next generation. The cities that burned held not just people, but the accumulated memory of the culture, the forges and the halls and the records, the physical substance of a civilization, reduced to fire in a single coordinated night, and the betrayal at the heart of it. Bo-Katan's surrender of the Darksaber, bought with a promise the Empire never meant to keep, is the final cruelty. The moment the leader of the Mandalorians paid the ultimate price of dishonor and received nothing in return but a deeper ruin. She gave up the symbol of her people's rule to save their lives, and their lives were taken anyway. And she was left with neither honor nor people nor blade, only the knowledge that she had surrendered everything for nothing. What survived the purge survived precisely because it had already been hiding, and there is a bleak lesson in that worth turning over. The Children of the Watch, the Helmet Zealots, the most extreme and inflexible of all the Mandalorian factions, the ones who held the harshest reading of the Creed, came through the Night of 1,000 Tears because they had been living in secret on a moon, in coverts hidden from the galaxy, practicing a fanatical secrecy that had seemed like madness to other Mandalorians right up until it became the only thing that kept anyone alive. The moderates, the ones who lived openly, the ones who had tried to find a normal place in the galaxy, were the ones who burned. The Zealots inherited the future by virtue of being too extreme to have ever come out of hiding in the first place. This is how cultures sometimes survive catastrophe, not through their best and most adaptable members, but through their most rigid and uncompromising ones, the fanatics who were already underground when the fire came. The Mandalorian creed that survived into the New Age was therefore a narrowed and hardened version of itself, carried by a sect that most Mandalorians across history would have found bizarre, and the long work of broadening it back out into the fuller tradition would fall to the lone foundlings and scattered survivors who slowly, painfully found each other again in the years that followed. The scattering itself echoes so precisely the scattering after Malachor V, thousands of years before, that it is hard not to hear the whole history rhyming with itself. After Malachor, the Mandalorians became a diaspora of mercenaries and bounty hunters, their nation broken, their symbol hidden, their warriors selling the only skill they had to whoever would pay. After the Night of 1,000 Tears, the same thing happened again. The same diaspora, the same scattered embers, the same lone warriors keeping the old skills alive in a galaxy that had once more concluded the Mandalorians were finished. Twice across the 10,000 years, the people were broken to fragments, and twice they were not actually destroyed, only dispersed, only forced back into the wandering survival from which they had reassembled themselves before. The pattern held. It always held. You scatter the Mandalorians, and they do not die. They simply wait. And in the waiting, the foundlings grow up, and the embers smolder, and the possibility of gathering remains alive in every covert and every lonely warrior, carrying the creed through the dark. And so the most brutal history in the galaxy arrives, in the end, not at extinction but at endurance, which is perhaps the most brutal thing of all, because endurance means the cycle is not finished. A people who simply died would at least be at peace. The Mandalorians do not get peace. They get survival, and survival means the wheel keeps turning, means there will be more gathering and more glory and more fracture and more fire, means the same ferocity that lets them outlast every catastrophe also guarantees the next one. They cannot be killed and they cannot stop. And those two facts together are the whole tragedy. A people too strong to die and too proud to change, carrying their magnificent and terrible creed forward into a future that will demand of them exactly what the past demanded and receive exactly the same answer. Let us go all the way back now, further than we went at the start, to the very beginning of the beginning, because the deepest origins of the Mandalorians hold a strange poetry that the later wars sometimes obscure. The Taung, the gray-skinned progenitors of the whole tradition, were one of the oldest sentient species in the galaxy, and their story begins on Coruscant, in a time so distant that calling it history feels almost too small a word. Coruscant then was not the city world it would become, not the gleaming planet-spanning metropolis at the heart of the Republic. It was wilder, contested, a world where the Taung and the early humans fought for dominance across an age longer than most species exist in total. The Taung were a warrior people even then, before they were Mandalorians, before they had a creed or a homeworld or a name beyond their own. War was in them from the start, and the war that defined them was the long losing struggle for their birth world. They lost. A united front of humans drove the Taung from Coruscant, exiled them from the world that had made them. And that exile is the original wound, the grievance beneath all the other grievances, the first defeat in a history that would be shaped forever by the refusal to accept defeat. The Taung who left Coruscant carried with them a hatred of the species that had cast them out, and a determination to never again be the ones driven from their home. They wandered, a people without a world, until they came to the gray planet that would become Mandalore. And there they found the Mythosaurs, and there they made their stand. The conquest of Mandalore by the first warrior to take the name is the founding myth, and like all founding myths, it carries more meaning than mere fact. The Mythosaurs were enormous, ancient, the apex of everything that lived on the gray world. And to conquer the planet meant to conquer them, and to conquer them meant to do something that should have been impossible. Mandalore the First did it, or so the legend says, and in doing it he established the central truth of the entire culture, the truth encoded in the skull they took as their symbol. You are what you can defeat. The Mythosaur skull on the Mandalorian banner is not decoration. It is a thesis statement 10,000 years old, declaring to anyone who sees it that these are the people who killed the unkillable thing, and that the question of whether they can be defeated has already been answered. In the negative, in the dawn of their history, they built their entire identity on the back of a beast they had broken, and they carried that beast's skull into every war that followed as a reminder to themselves and to everyone else of what they were capable of. The name they took for themselves before they were Mandalorians, the Dha Werda Verda, the Warriors of the Shadow, captures something the later history would prove again and again. They thought of themselves as warriors first and foremost, before any other identity, before species or homeworld or nation. The shadow they fought in was the shadow of their own exile, the long darkness of a people who had lost their birth world and resolved to take and hold a new one by force. Everything that made the Mandalorians terrible, the ferocity, the refusal to submit, the conviction that strength was the only thing that mattered, grew from that original soil of exile and grievance, and the iron determination to never be the victims again. They had been the ones driven out once in the deep past, and they organized their entire civilization around the promise that it would never happen again. The terrible irony, of course, is that it happened again and again, that the people who swore never to be exiled were exiled repeatedly across their history, scattered after Malachor and scattered after the Purge, the original wound reopening across the millennia. No matter how strong they became, they could not escape the pattern of their own beginning. The exiles who conquered a world to stop being exiles became, in the end, exiles again, the wheel turning all the way back to where it started. The Mandalorian Wars in particular were shaped by a hidden hand that the warriors themselves never fully understood. The aggression of Mandalore the Ultimate, the precise timing of the invasion, the way it drew the Republic and the Jedi into exactly the kind of total war that would corrupt and weaken them, all of it served purposes beyond the Mandalorians' own desire for conquest. There were forces in the deep shadow that wanted the Republic bled and the Jedi pushed toward darkness, and the Mandalorian invasion was the instrument that accomplished both. The warriors thought they were fighting their own crusade. They were, in part, fighting someone else's, and the someone else was content to spend the entire Mandalorian people to achieve a strategic result that had nothing to do with Mandalorian glory. This is the bitterest reading of the great defeat at Malachor V. The Mandalorians were not simply beaten by Revan's cold genius. They were used up, expended, by powers that saw them as a means to an end, and the end was the corruption of the Jedi who defeated them. Even in their greatest war, the Mandalorians were a tool in someone else's hand, and the tragedy of being a magnificent weapon is that weapons get used by whoever can grip them and then discarded when the work is done. The specific battles of that war became legend among those who study such things, and they show the Mandalorian way at its most effective and most terrible. The early campaigns, where the Neo-Crusaders rolled over the Outer Rim worlds the Republic had abandoned, demonstrated the cold efficiency of Cassius Fett's incorporation system, each conquest feeding the next. The middle period, when the Republic finally committed and the war became a grinding contest of attrition, showed the Mandalorian capacity for endurance, their willingness to absorb staggering losses and keep coming, because a people unafraid of death do not break the way ordinary armies break. And the final phase, the trap at Malachor V, showed the one thing that could actually stop them, which was an enemy willing to be as ruthless as they were, and more, willing to spend lives the way they spent lives, willing to cross the moral lines the Mandalorians had never bothered to draw in the first place. Revan beat them by meeting their ruthlessness with a greater ruthlessness, and the galaxy paid for that lesson in the Jedi Civil War that followed. When the ruthlessness Revan had built up to beat the Mandalorians turned inward and nearly destroyed the Republic from within. The Mandalorians, even in losing, had a way of corrupting their conquerors, of forcing everyone who fought them to become a little more like them, harder and colder, and more willing to do the unforgivable. That was their final revenge on a galaxy that kept defeating them. They made their victors pay in the only currency that mattered, the currency of the soul. The warriors of the Knights of the Old Republic era, the ones who fought through the Mandalorian Wars and the Jedi Civil War that followed, are remembered as some of the most formidable Mandalorians who ever lived, precisely because they were tested against the most extreme circumstances the history ever produced. Canderous Ordo, who became Mandalore the Preserver, was forged in those wars. and the wisdom he eventually brought to the leadership of his people was the hard-won wisdom of a man who had seen the warrior way taken to its absolute limit and watched it shatter against Malachor V. He understood, as few Mandalores before him had, that strength alone was not enough, that a people who only knew how to fight would eventually find a war they could not survive, and that the survival of the creed required more than ferocity. It required restraint, judgment, the wisdom to know which battles were worth the cost. He could not fully reform his people because the creed was older and stronger than any single Mandalore, but he bent it briefly towards survival. And the fact that the Mandalorians existed at all in the later ages owes something to that bending. The Preserver preserved against the grain of everything his people believed, and it is one of the few hopeful notes in the whole long history. The moment when a Mandalore looked at the cost of the creed and chose for once to pay a little less. What all of this builds toward, when you stand back far enough to see the whole shape of it, is a portrait of a people caught in a trap of their own making, a trap built from their own virtues. Courage became recklessness, honor became rigidity, strength became the inability to ever choose anything but strength. Loyalty to the creed became the inability to adapt the creed, when adaptation was the only thing that could save them. Every Mandalorian virtue, pushed to the extreme the culture demanded, curdled into the vice that destroyed them, and they could not stop pushing, because the pushing was the whole point, the proving of the self against ever greater challenges, until finally the challenge was greater than they were. They were like a blade that could only be sharpened, never sheathed, growing keener and keener until it cut the hand that held it. And they knew this about themselves, in their clearer moments. The wisest of them, the Preservers and the Satines, saw the trap clearly and tried to escape it, and the culture destroyed them for trying, because the culture could not survive the escape any more than it could survive the trap. They were doomed coming and going, and they met that doom the only way they knew how, which was head-on, armored, unafraid, walking toward the fire because the fire was the only place they had ever truly felt at home. It is worth gathering the great Mandalores into one place near the end, the way you might lay out a line of portraits in a hall, because the title each one chose tells you what they believed they were for. And the sequence of those titles is the whole arc of the history in miniature. Mandalore I, the conqueror who broke the Mythosaurs and founded everything. Mandalore the Conqueror, and later the Indomitable, who led the Crusaders into the Great Sith War and bound his people to a fallen Jedi, and died on a savage moon. Mandalore the Ultimate, who built the Neo-Crusader machine and waged the war that broke against Revan at Malachor V, the last Taung to lead. Mandalore the Preserver, Canderous Ordo, who gathered the scattered survivors and chose for the first time a name that meant keeping rather than taking. Read those titles in order, and you can watch the culture's understanding of itself evolve and darken, and finally, briefly soften. Conqueror, Indomitable, Ultimate, Preserver. The arc bends from pure aggression towards something almost like wisdom, and then the long centuries swallow the line, and the names stop being recorded with the same care, until the final age brings new claimants and the old cycle resumes. The warriors who served under those Mandalores were, individually, among the deadliest beings the galaxy ever produced, and the tradition is full of them. There were the great duelists, the warriors who killed Jedi in single combat and lived to paint the deed into their armor. There were the strategists like Jango Fett, minds as sharp as any general the Republic ever fielded, who understood that ferocity without direction is merely noise, and that the true terror of the Mandalorians lay in ferocity yoked to intelligence. There were the lone hunters of the later ages, Jango and Boba, who carried the warrior craft into a galaxy that had mostly forgotten its origins, killing for credits in a tradition that had once killed for glory. The crusading purpose dwindled but the lethal skill undiminished. Across 10,000 years, the specific faces changed constantly, but the type endured. The Mandalorian warrior, fearless and armored and supremely capable, walking toward the thing everyone else ran from. Again and again, generation after generation, world without end. And the galaxy's view of them is its own kind of mirror, worth holding up at the close. To the worlds of the deep past, the Mandalorians were a natural disaster, a thing that fell from the sky and took what it wanted. To the Jedi, they were the worthy enemy, the one foe whose defeat actually proved something. The test that the Order both feared and, in some buried way, respected. To the Republic, they were a recurring nightmare, a threat that kept returning no matter how many times it was put down. A proof that the galaxy's peace was always provisional and always temporary. To the Empire, they were a security problem to be solved with overwhelming force, and the Empire's failure to truly solve it, its discovery that even genocide only scattered them, is the final proof of what these people were. And to the scattered survivors of the modern age, the foundlings and the zealots and the lonely bounty hunters, the Mandalorians were home. The thing worth surviving for, the creed that had taken them in when they had nothing and made them part of something 10,000 years old. The same people, seen from every angle, looked completely different, and yet the core was always the same. Strength, freedom, the refusal to submit, the conviction that a life unproven in struggle is a life unlived. Every observer saw their own fears or hopes reflected in the horned helmet, but behind the helmet, the creed never changed. There is one more thing to say before we let the story rest, and it is the thing that makes the whole history worth telling, rather than merely cataloging. The Mandalorians are a tragedy in the oldest and truest sense, which is that their downfall flowed inevitably from their greatness. The very things that made them magnificent were the things that destroyed them, and they could not have one without the other. Their ferocity made them unconquerable and ungovernable. Their refusal to submit made them impossible to defeat and impossible to unite. Their creed made them immortal as an idea and doomed as a people, because a creed that values the individual's proving above the survival of the whole will always eventually see the whole torn apart by individuals proving themselves against each other. They were great because they would not bend, and they fell because they would not bend, and there was no version of them that kept the greatness without the fall. Satine understood this and tried to change it and was destroyed for trying. The warriors understood it too, in their way, and chose the greatness and the fall together, knowingly, again and again, because to them a magnificent doom was infinitely preferable to a safe diminishment. That is the brutal heart of it. They were not victims of their history. They were the authors of it, choosing the fire over and over with their eyes open, because the fire was the only thing that felt to them like being truly alive. So that is the lore of the Mandalorians. 10,000 years of it, from the gray-skinned exiles driven off Coruscant in the dawn of time, to the scattered embers carrying the creed through the long night of the Empire. From the Mythosaur skull to the Darksaber, from the crusades that fell out of the sky on living war droids, to the lonely foundling protecting a small green child in a galaxy that had forgotten what his armor once meant. A people held together by a creed instead of a country, who could be scattered but never destroyed, who paid for their magnificence in blood across 100 centuries and kept choosing to pay it because the alternative was to become something other than themselves. And that was the one defeat they would never accept. Before you drift off, let me ask the last small thing of the night, and then I will leave you to the quiet. If this long walk through the dark history was good company, if it did what it was meant to do and carried you gently towards sleep, then the most helpful thing you can do, beyond the subscribe and the comment I asked about earlier, is to let this one play all the way through. Let it run while you sleep. The full watch, start to finish, is the single clearest signal that a video like this is worth making. And it is what lets me keep building these long, quiet histories for you and for everyone else who finds their rest in old stories told slow. That is all. Thank you for spending these hours here in the dark with the warriors who would not stop fighting. Sleep well. The gray planet will still be turning when you wake, and there are 10,000 more years of stories where this one came from, waiting for the next quiet night. Rest now. The story is over, and you are safe, and the fire that could not be killed burns on somewhere far away, where it cannot trouble your sleep.